In the ancient cities of Mesopotamia, buried beneath millennia of sand and silence, clay tablets waited in darkness. When archaeologists finally unearthed them, they expected records of grain harvests and temple offerings. What they found was far more disturbing. Among thousands of mundane inscriptions, a handful of tablets spoke of beings called the Anunnaki, entities who, according to these ancient scribes, possessed the power to reshape not just civilization, but memory itself. 100 years, an entire century of human experience, allegedly stripped from collective consciousness. No records, no monuments, no descendants who remember. Tonight, we journey into one of history's most haunting possibilities and ask what else we may have been made to forget. Between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, there lies a land that was once green and fertile, a crescent of abundance in a region that today we know mostly as desert. And it was here in this narrow corridor of life, giving water and rich soil, that something unprecedented occurred in the long story of our species. For it was here that human beings first gathered in numbers large enough to call themselves citizens of cities. Here that they first pressed reed stylus into wet clay to record their thoughts for generations. Yet unborn, here that the curtain rose on what we call civilization itself. And to understand what may have been taken from human memory, we must first understand this place and these people who emerged from prehistory with such startling suddenness that scholars still debate how it was possible. The land of Mesopotamia, and meaning simply the land between the rivers in Greek, stretches across what is now modern Iraq and parts of Syria and Turkey. And in ancient times, this region experienced annual flooding that deposited rich silt across the plains, creating agricultural conditions so favorable that small farming communities could grow surplus food. And surplus food meant that not everyone needed to farm. And when not everyone needs to farm, then some people can become priests and scribes, and artisans and administrators. And this is the simple chain of abundance that leads eventually to temples and palaces and written law, though saying it simply does not capture the mystery of how quickly it happened here compared to anywhere else on Earth. The climate of ancient Mesopotamia was warmer and wetter than today. The rivers broader and more generous. The marshlands of the south teeming with fish and fowl, date palms growing in abundance along the waterways. And yet this same environment existed in other places around the world. Other river valleys with other floods depositing other silts. And yet none of them produced cities and writing and mathematics and astronomy with the speed and sophistication that emerged here between 6,000 and 5,000 years ago, which suggests that favorable geography alone cannot explain what happened in this particular patch of Earth. When we speak of the Sumerians, we speak of a puzzle that has occupied scholars for over a century. For these people who built the first cities and invented the first writing system seem to have no clear ancestors, no obvious point of origin, no linguistic relatives anywhere in the world. And this is what academics call the Sumerian problem, the uncomfortable fact that the founders of civilization appear in the archaeological record almost fully formed, with technologies and social structures that elsewhere took millennia to develop. And their own texts claim quite explicitly that their knowledge and their kingship came down from heaven, a phrase that most scholars interpret as metaphor, but which sits uncomfortably alongside the other anomalies. The Sumerian language belongs to no known language family, which is extraordinary when you consider that most ancient languages can be traced through grammar and vocabulary to relatives and descendants, the way Latin branches into Italian and Spanish and French. But Sumerian stands alone, an isolate with no siblings or cousins or parents that we can identify. And while some linguists have attempted to connect it to other language families from Dravidian to Tibetan to Basque, none of these proposals have gained scholarly acceptance, leaving us with a people who spoke a tongue unlike any other who lived before or after them in that region. The Sumerians themselves had stories about where they came from, and these stories speak of a time before kingship descended from heaven, a time before the great flood that they too recorded in their texts long before it appeared in the Hebrew Bible. And they spoke of a people called the black-headed ones, which was their term for themselves. And they spoke of arriving in a land they called Sumer from somewhere else, though where that somewhere else might have been remains unclear from the fragmentary records that survive. And it is worth pausing here to note that their own origin stories contain this element of coming from elsewhere, of bringing knowledge with them rather than developing it in place. Consider now the cities that rose from this land, and try to hold in your mind the scale of what was achieved. For Uruk alone may have had a population approaching 50,000 people in an age when most human beings still lived in villages of a few hundred at most. And 50,000 people living together requires sanitation systems and food distribution networks and legal frameworks and administrative bureaucracies and religious institutions to provide shared meaning. And all of these things appear in Uruk during the 4th millennium before the Common Era, are making it a city more populous and more sophisticated than most European cities would be for another 4,000 years. The city of Ur, famous as the birthplace of the patriarch Abraham according to biblical tradition, was a metropolis of ziggurats and harbors, a trading center that connected Mesopotamia to the Persian Gulf, and from there to the civilizations of the Indus Valley and beyond. And its royal tombs contained treasures of gold and lapis lazuli and sophisticated musical instruments. And they also contained the remains of servants sacrificed to accompany their rulers into death, which tells us something about the religious convictions and the social stratification that existed in these earliest of cities. Eridu was considered by the Sumerians themselves to be the first city, the place where kingship first touched the earth. And its ruins contain a sequence of temples built one atop another, going back to the very beginning of settlement in the region. And the god of Eridu was Enki, the lord of wisdom and sweet water, who features prominently in the stories we will soon discuss. The deity who, according to the tablets, played a central role in the creation of humanity and who often advocated for human interests against the wishes of other divine beings. Nippur was the religious center of Sumer, home to the temple of Enlil, the chief of the gods in later periods, and it was here that scholars believe many of the great literary and religious texts were composed, or at least compiled, making Nippur something like the Vatican of the ancient world, a place of pilgrimage and theological authority that retained its prestige across many centuries and many political changes. What all of these cities share is a level of organization and cultural sophistication that seems to leap rather than climb into existence. And while archaeologists can trace gradual developments in pottery styles and building techniques going back thousands of years before the cities emerged, The transition from village to metropolis happened with remarkable speed. Within just a few centuries, transforming scattered agricultural communities into something resembling a civilization. And it is this speed of development that makes some researchers wonder whether the Sumerians might have had help of some kind. Whether from human migrants from an unknown advanced culture or from the divine beings their own texts describe so insistently. The invention of writing may be the single most important development in human history, for it is writing that allows knowledge to accumulate across generations. Writing that permits the dead to speak to the living. Writing that creates the possibility of history itself rather than mere oral legend. And this invention occurred first in Sumer, emerging from the practical needs of temple administrators who needed to track offerings and distributions and obligations in an economy too complex for memory alone. The earliest cuneiform signs were simple pictures, a stylized head of grain meaning barley, a circle meaning sheep, and these pictographs served well enough for keeping accounts. But over centuries, the pictures became more abstract and more versatile, capable of representing not just objects, but actions and qualities, and eventually the sounds of spoken language, until by the middle of the 3rd millennium, the cuneiform script could record anything that could be said, from royal proclamations to personal letters to epic poetry, to astronomical observations. And this evolution from pictures to phonetic symbols is one of the great intellectual achievements of our species, even if it happened gradually and unconsciously. The tools of cuneiform writing were simple but effective. A reed stylus cut to create a wedge-shaped impression, and a tablet of wet clay that would dry hard in the sun or be baked for permanence. And this combination of materials had the great advantage of durability. For while papyrus rots and parchment burns, clay survives. And we have recovered tablets that were written 5,000 years ago that are still legible today. The fingerprints of their scribes still visible in the clay where they held it. The mistakes they made and corrected still apparent. These objects offering a kind of intimacy with the ancient past that few other artifacts can match. The scribes of Mesopotamia formed a professional class, trained for years in schools called tablet houses, and their education involved copying and memorizing vast amounts of text, from multiplication tables to literary classics. And this training was difficult and strictly disciplined, producing scholars who served in temples and palaces, keeping the records that made complex society possible. And among their duties was the preservation of older texts by copying them onto new tablets when the old ones became damaged or worn. A practice that preserved literary and religious works across millennia, even as the languages and empires changed around them. When the great library of Ashurbanipal was excavated at Nineveh in the 19th century, archaeologists discovered over 30,000 tablets and fragments, a collection deliberately assembled by that Assyrian king who sent scribes throughout his empire to copy texts and bring them back to his capital. And among these tablets were found the Babylonian creation epic and the Epic of Gilgamesh, and countless other texts that had been preserved through generations of careful copying, revealing to the modern world for the first time the depth and sophistication of Mesopotamian literature. And yet, this library, as vast as it was, represents only a fraction of what once existed, only what one king in one city chose to preserve. Temple archives throughout Mesopotamia contained their own collections, and administrative buildings in every city kept records of their own affairs, and private individuals maintained correspondence and contracts and literary texts in their own homes. And when you multiply all of these sources across all of the cities, across all of the centuries, you begin to understand the staggering scale of the textual record that ancient Mesopotamia produced. A record of which we have recovered perhaps 500,000 tablets and fragments, with estimates suggesting that millions more remain buried beneath the tells and ruins of Iraq. Many of them likely never to be excavated, given the political and economic challenges facing archaeology in that region today. Of the tablets we have recovered, only a fraction have been fully translated, perhaps 10 or 15% according to some estimates, the work of translation being slow and painstaking and requiring specialized expertise that relatively few scholars possess. And this means that even among the tablets sitting in museum collections around the world, there are texts that have not yet been read by anyone in modern times. They're secrets waiting for a scholar who has not yet been born or who is currently occupied with other fragments. And one can only wonder what might be contained in these unread tablets. What information might have been preserved by ancient scribes that we have not yet allowed to speak? The content of the tablets that have been translated reveals a civilization obsessed with record-keeping and deeply committed to the preservation of knowledge. For we have tablets recording everything from the sale of a single sheep to the movements of the planets across decades of observations, from the complaints of students about their teachers to the laments of kings over fallen cities, from legal codes specifying the penalties for various crimes, to medical texts describing symptoms and treatments that in some cases correspond to modern diagnoses, revealing a people who took seriously the project of understanding their world and transmitting that understanding to future generations. The administrative records are by far the most numerous, lists and tallies and accounts that are individually mundane but collectively reveal the intricate workings of temple economies and palace bureaucracies, the flow of grain and silver and labor through the institutions that organized Sumerian and later Babylonian and Assyrian society. And while these records may seem dry to us, they were essential to the functioning of cities that depended on complex systems of distribution and obligation to feed their populations and maintain their temples and field their armies. The legal codes of Mesopotamia predate the famous Code of Hammurabi by centuries. With the Code of Ur-Nammu and the Code of Lipit Ishtar establishing principles of justice and punishment that would influence legal thinking throughout the ancient Near East and beyond. And these laws reveal a society concerned with property rights and family obligations and the regulation of commerce and the punishment of violence. A society recognizable in many ways despite the gulf of time that separates us. People dealing with disputes between neighbors and questions of inheritance and the consequences of broken contracts, just as people do today. The mathematical tablets reveal a sophisticated understanding of arithmetic and geometry and algebra, with problems and solutions that demonstrate the Mesopotamian mastery of base 60 calculations that we still use today when we divide hours into 60 minutes and minutes into 60 seconds and circles into 360 degrees. And their astronomical tablets record centuries of observations tracking the movements of the moon and planets with such precision that modern astronomers have used them to calculate the dates of ancient eclipses and to study long-term changes in the Earth's rotation. The medical tablets describe symptoms and treatments and prognoses with a combination of practical observation and magical thinking that characterized ancient medicine throughout the world, listing herbal remedies alongside incantations, physical interventions alongside appeals to the gods. And, while we would not want to be treated by a Mesopotamian physician, we can recognize in their texts the beginning of the systematic approach to healing that would eventually become modern medicine. And then there are the myths, the texts that describe not the mundane business of daily life, but the cosmic drama of creation and the deeds of gods and heroes. And these texts occupy a smaller portion of the total corpus. But they loom large in our imagination because they speak to questions that still concern us, questions about where we came from and why we are here, and what powers might exist beyond the visible world, and what relationship we might have to them. The Enuma Elish tells the Babylonian story of creation, how in the beginning there was only water, the mingled waters of Apsu, the fresh, and Tiamat, the salt, and how from their union came the first gods, and how conflict arose between the older gods and the younger, and how Marduk the champion slew Tiamat, and from her body fashioned the heavens and the earth, and how from the blood of a defeated god, humanity was created to serve the divine ones and free them from toil. And this story was recited every year at the New Year festival in Babylon, a ritual reenactment that renewed the cosmic order and confirmed the king's authority. The Eridu Genesis offers an earlier Sumerian account of creation, fragmentary but revealing, describing how the gods established kingship and cities, and how a great flood destroyed the early world, and how one man was warned and saved to preserve humanity. This flood narrative, predating the biblical account by many centuries, and raising questions about shared sources or parallel traditions that scholars continue to debate. And it is worth noting that the flood appears in Mesopotamian literature not once, but repeatedly in the Atrahasis epic and the Gilgamesh epic and various other texts, always with the same basic structure of divine decision to destroy and divine intervention to save a remnant. The divine hierarchy of Mesopotamian religion placed the sky god at the theoretical head, but with Enlil, the storm god, holding practical power, and Enki, the water god, possessing wisdom and cunning. And beneath these three great deities were ranks of lesser gods with their own spheres of influence and their own temples and their own cults. And the whole assembly of divine beings was imagined as functioning something like a royal court, meeting in council to make decisions that affected both heaven and earth. Among the divine beings mentioned repeatedly in these texts are the Anunnaki, a name that appears hundreds of times across different tablets from different cities and different centuries, and the name itself has been translated various ways, with the most literal reading being something like those of princely seed or those who are from heaven and earth. Though popular writers have favored the translation, those who from heaven came down, or those who from heaven to earth came, emphasizing a celestial origin that fits certain interpretive frameworks. In the standard scholarly understanding, the Anunnaki are simply the great gods collectively, the assembly of major deities who gather to make cosmic decisions, and this interpretation fits most of the contexts in which they appear. But there are other passages where the Anunnaki seem to be something more specific, a group of beings associated particularly with the underworld, and with judgment, and with the establishment of human destiny. And these passages have attracted attention from those who see in the tablets evidence of something stranger than mythology. what should give any thoughtful person pause is the remarkable consistency with which these stories appear across different sources. For we are not dealing with a single text from a single place, but with multiple texts from multiple cities composed over centuries, and yet telling essentially the same stories with the same characters and the same plot points. The same numbers appearing again and again, the same names recurring with the same relationships, the same events described with variations in detail but not in substance. And this consistency is difficult to explain if we are dealing only with imaginative fiction. When the scribes of wrote about the Anunnaki numbering 50 great gods of heaven and earth, and the scribes of Nippur wrote of the same 50, and the scribes of Babylon inherited this same number, we might attribute this to cultural diffusion and shared tradition. But when the texts agree not only on numbers, but on specific names and specific relationships and specific events, when they describe the same council making the same decisions for the same reasons, the consistency begins to feel less like mythology and more like history, or at least like memory of something that once happened and was carefully preserved through the mechanism of sacred scribal tradition. The tablets describe the Anunnaki not as vague spiritual forces, but as beings with personalities and physical forms, beings who ate and drank and quarreled and had children, beings who needed labor to support their temples, and who created humanity specifically to provide that labor. Beings who could be pleased or angered, and who intervened in human affairs in concrete ways. And while we can read all of this as metaphor and projection, as early humans imagining their gods in their own image, there is something in the specificity of the descriptions that resists easy dismissal. The tablets speak of many divine beings, with many roles and many relationships to humanity. But among them, the Anunnaki hold a peculiar position, neither quite the distant high gods, nor quite the minor spirits, but beings intimately involved with human origins and human destiny, and the very structure of human consciousness itself, and their relationship with humanity, according to these ancient scribes, was far more direct and far more consequential than any religion since has dared to teach us. We turn now to the texts themselves, to the clay tablets that have survived flood and fire and the slow grinding of millennia. And we ask them directly what they say about these beings called the Anunnaki. And the answer that comes back to us across 4,000 years is both stranger and more consistent than we might expect from mere mythology. The primary sources for understanding the Anunnaki are not obscure or contested documents hidden in private collections, but rather some of the most famous and thoroughly studied texts in all of ancient literature, beginning with the Atrahasis epic, a Babylonian creation and flood narrative that predates the biblical Genesis by more than 1,000 years, and survives in multiple copies from different periods, suggesting it was considered important enough to preserve and recopying generation after generation. The Atrahasis tells us something remarkable right from its opening lines, describing a time before humanity existed, when the gods themselves were forced to labor. When the Anunnaki, who dwelt in the heavens, imposed the work of digging canals and clearing channels upon a lesser class of divine beings called the Igigi. And this arrangement, the text tells us, persisted for 40 years before the Igigi could bear it no longer and rose up in rebellion, burning their tools and surrounding the dwelling of Enlil, the chief administrator of earthly affairs, in the middle of the night. What happens next in the Atrahasis is the moment that scholars have puzzled over for more than a century, for the response to this labor crisis is not punishment or negotiation, but innovation. As the god Enki, known for his wisdom and cunning, proposes a solution that will change everything. Let one god be slaughtered, Enki suggests, and let the birth goddess mix his flesh and blood with clay, so that God and man may be thoroughly mixed in the clay, and let us hear the heartbeat for the rest of time. Let there be a spirit from the god's flesh, and let it proclaim the living sign as its memory, a spirit to keep the dead alive. The language here is extraordinary, for it describes not simply a mystical creation, but something that sounds almost procedural, a recipe involving specific ingredients, divine essence and earthly matter, combined according to a deliberate formula, and the purpose is stated with uncomfortable clarity. These new beings will take over the labor that the gods no longer wish to perform. The Enki and Ninmah texts provide additional details about this creation process, describing multiple attempts to form humanity correctly, failed prototypes that emerge blind or unable to hold their water, or with various other defects, until finally the recipe is perfected and the first successful humans come into being, fashioned to serve, designed to work, or created specifically to relieve the gods of their burden. We must sit with the implications of this for a moment, for if we take these texts at their word, if we read them not as primitive attempts to explain what ancient peoples could not understand, but as accounts, however stylized, of events their ancestors witnessed or were told about, then the picture that emerges is troubling in its clarity. Humanity, according to the oldest written records we possess, was not created out of divine love or cosmic accident, but out of practical necessity, a labor-saving innovation, a biological tool designed by beings who had the power to create life, but not the patience to dig their own canals. The division of labor within the Anunnaki themselves adds another layer of complexity. For the texts distinguish between those Anunnaki who remained in the celestial realm and those who descended to operate in the underworld, a term that scholars have traditionally interpreted as the land of the dead, but which might equally describe subterranean facilities or simply the earth itself viewed from a heavenly perspective. The celestial Anunnaki numbered 300 according to the Atrahasis, while another 300 were assigned to the underworld. And this neat administrative division, this almost corporate structure with its different departments and territories, does not sound like the organic development of religious imagination, but like the memory of an actual organizational system being described in the only terms available to Bronze Age scribes. The royal inscriptions of ancient Mesopotamia provide yet another angle of evidence. For the kings of Sumer and Akkad and Babylon did not claim merely to rule by divine right in some abstract sense, but repeatedly attributed specific interventions to specific Anunnaki at specific moments in their reigns. And these attributions were not casual or ornamental, but were inscribed on monuments intended to last forever, legal documents in stone testifying to relationships between mortal rulers and divine powers. We should pause here to acknowledge what we are doing, for there is a great difference between reading these texts as literature, as fascinating windows into ancient thought, and reading them as potential evidence of actual events. And mainstream scholarship has firmly committed to the former approach, while a persistent alternative tradition insists on exploring the latter. The name most associated with this alternative approach is Zecharia Sitchin, a Russian-born researcher who published The 12th Planet in 1976 and went on to write a dozen more books elaborating his thesis that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial beings from a planet called Nibiru, who came to Earth hundreds of thousands of years ago and genetically engineered humanity to serve as workers in their gold mining operations. Sitchin's work has been enormously influential, selling millions of copies and spawning an entire subculture of researchers who build upon his translations and conclusions. Yet his methodology has been severely criticized by mainstream Assyriologists, who point out that his readings of cuneiform often diverge dramatically from scholarly consensus, and that he sometimes cites tablets or passages that cannot be verified in any museum collection. The specific claim that the word Shem, which appears throughout ancient texts and is usually translated as name or renown, actually means rocket ship is perhaps the most controversial of Sitchin's interpretations, and professional translators have pointed out that this reading requires ignoring the overwhelming contextual evidence that Shem functions linguistically exactly as one would expect a word meaning name or reputation to function. And yet, we cannot simply dismiss Sitchin and move on for whatever his scholarly limitations. He did something that academic Assyriology had failed to do. He read the ancient texts literally. He took them seriously as potential accounts of real events, and he asked questions that more cautious researchers had avoided. What if the stories of gods descending from heaven are not metaphors? What if the detailed genealogies of divine beings reflect actual lineages? What if the weapons of terrible power wielded by the Anunnaki in their various conflicts describe real technologies? These questions may make professional scholars uncomfortable, but they are not unreasonable questions to ask of texts that present themselves not as fiction or allegory, but as history. Erich von Däniken, whose Chariots of the Gods predated Sitchin's first book by several years, approached the same territory from a different angle, examining not just Mesopotamian texts, but evidence from around the world that seemed to suggest ancient contact with technologically advanced beings. And while von Däniken's work has been criticized even more harshly than Sitchin's for its selective use of evidence and its tendency to underestimate the capabilities of ancient peoples, the core question he raised remains hauntingly valid. Why do so many ancient cultures describe their gods arriving from the sky in vehicles of fire, teaching advanced knowledge, and then departing with promises to return? Beyond these controversial figures, there exist more measured approaches to the mystery of ancient knowledge that do not require accepting specific claims about extraterrestrials or mistranslated rockets, but that nonetheless acknowledge genuine puzzles in the archaeological record. The megalithic complex at Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey has revolutionized our understanding of prehistoric capability. For here stand massive carved pillars arranged in precise circles that date to nearly 12,000 years ago, a time when humans were supposedly simple hunter-gatherers without the social organization or technical skill to create monumental architecture. The implications of Göbekli Tepe are still being processed by the scholarly community, but at minimum they suggest that our narrative of gradual human development from primitive beginnings may be missing significant chapters, and this opens space for wondering what else we might not know about our species' early history. The Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis. which proposes that a comet or asteroid fragment struck the Earth approximately 12,800 years ago and caused catastrophic climate change and widespread destruction, offers another framework for understanding potential discontinuities in human development. For if a global cataclysm did occur at this time, then much evidence of whatever preceded it might have been lost, and the survivors might have needed to rebuild from a greatly diminished knowledge base, preserving only fragments of what had once been known. We are not required to accept any particular alternative theory to acknowledge that the mainstream narrative of human history contains gaps, that the emergence of complex civilization in Mesopotamia around 5,000 years ago seems remarkably sudden, given what we know came before, and that the texts produced by that civilization describe their own origins in ways that do not match the gradual, unassisted development we would expect. But let us return to what the texts themselves describe about the powers of the Anunnaki, for this is where the picture becomes most intriguing and most relevant to the specific claim we are building toward. The capabilities attributed to these beings in consistent accounts across multiple texts and multiple centuries include what we would now recognize as advanced technologies, vehicles that could travel through the sky, weapons capable of destroying entire cities, knowledge of biology sufficient to create and modify living beings, and the ability to communicate across vast distances instantaneously. When Inanna descends to the underworld in the famous text bearing her name, she must pass through 7 gates, and at each gate she is required to remove an article of clothing or jewelry, items that are described with technical specificity and that some researchers have interpreted as components of a technological apparatus that rendered her invulnerable, a kind of protective equipment that had to be surrendered before she could enter the realm of her sister Ereshkigal. The weapons used in the conflicts between various Anunnaki factions are described with a vividness that goes beyond mere poetic exaggeration. Ninurta, pursuing the demon Asag with a mace that shoots fire, the 7 weapons of error that bring plague and devastation. The deluge itself, described in the Atrahasis as a deliberate act of destruction decided upon by the Divine Council, because humanity had become too numerous and too noisy. The medical and biological capabilities of the Anunnaki extend beyond the initial creation of humanity, for the texts describe ongoing interventions in human health and reproduction, blessings of fertility and curses of barrenness dispensed according to divine will, modifications and adjustments to the human organism made by beings who understood its workings intimately because they had designed it. Perhaps the most significant artifact described in Mesopotamian literature is the Tablet of Destinies, known in Sumerian as the Dub-Namtara and in Akkadian as the Tupi-Shimati, an object of such power that multiple myths revolve around its theft and recovery, and that whoever possessed it could allegedly control the fate of all things. The Anzu myth describes a bird-like being who steals the Tablet of Destinies from Enlil and must be defeated by Ninurta to recover it. And the text is explicit that with the tablet, Anzu held the Enlil ship, the authority over heaven and earth, suggesting that this was not merely a symbol of power, but the actual source of it, a technology rather than a token. Some scholars have interpreted the Tablet of Destinies as an early concept of a book of fate, a metaphor for divine knowledge of what is to come. But this reading struggles with the physical descriptions of the tablet, its theft and transport and concealment, actions that make sense only if we are dealing with an actual object. If the Tablet of Destinies was a technology that could influence or determine outcomes across time, a device that could reshape reality according to the will of its possessor, then we are contemplating something that exceeds our current understanding of physics, but that would explain both the mythological importance attached to it and the desperate conflicts waged for its control. The Sumerian language itself provides evidence that these ancient people had sophisticated concepts related to mind and memory, concepts that went beyond what we might expect from a supposedly primitive culture. The word for memory, or something very close to it, was namshub, which also carries connotations of incantation or spell, suggesting that in the Sumerian understanding, memory and the magical manipulation of consciousness were closely linked. The capacity to make someone forget was known and named, and curses that invoked forgetting as a punishment appear in various texts, formulaic expressions that call upon the gods to erase a person's name, to wipe their memory from the earth, to cause all knowledge of them to vanish as if they had never been. Even more significant is the concept of the me, the divine decrees or cosmic powers that together comprised everything necessary for civilization to function. The me were not abstract principles, but were described as objects that could be held and transported and given and stolen. And when Inanna famously tricked Enki into giving her the me while he was drunk, she loaded them onto her boat and physically carried them from Eridu to Uruk, a journey during which Enki, sobered and regretful, sent various monsters to intercept her and reclaim what he had given away. The list of me that Inanna obtained is remarkable in its scope, including not just obvious civilizational elements like kingship and priestly office and craftsmanship, but also more peculiar items like the descent to the underworld, the ascent from the underworld, the standard, the quiver, sexual intercourse, kissing, prostitution, forthright speech, deceitful speech, the troubled heart, the rejoicing heart, and dozens of others. A complete inventory of what makes human experience human, all of it apparently controllable, transferable, and manipulable by beings with the knowledge and authority to do so. If the me could be given and taken, if the fundamental building blocks of human experience existed as discrete elements that the Anunnaki could manipulate, then we must ask what prevented them from manipulating memory itself, from altering or erasing specific periods of human experience as easily as they could bestow or withdraw any other me. The logic of the Sumerian cosmological system as preserved in these texts suggests not only that such manipulation was possible, but that it was inherent in the relationship between creators and created. For if we are dealing with beings who designed humanity for service, who maintained detailed oversight of human affairs through temple complexes and priest intermediaries, who demonstrated repeatedly their ability to intervene in human destiny through blessing and curse, flood and deliverance, then the control of human memory would not be an extraordinary power, but simply another tool in an already formidable toolkit. We should remember that from the perspective described in these texts, our humanity exists for the benefit of the Anunnaki, not the reverse. And a servant species that remembered too much, that accumulated knowledge that might eventually allow it to challenge its creators or to escape their control, would be a servant species that required periodic management. The question of why such powerful beings would need human servants in the first place has troubled researchers who take the texts literally. For if the Anunnaki could engineer life itself, surely they could have created machines or more compliant organisms. But the texts suggest an answer in the specific requirement for human worship, for the temples and offerings and prayers that sustain the gods in some manner that is never fully explained, but that seems to involve something that only conscious beings with the capacity for reverence could provide. This need for worship creates a delicate balance, for the Anunnaki apparently required human consciousness developed enough to offer meaningful devotion, but not so developed that humans might question the arrangement. And this balance, the texts hint, had to be actively maintained through interventions that sometimes took the form of catastrophe and restart. The flood being the most famous, but perhaps not the only example of the gods thinning a human population that had become too numerous or too knowing for comfort. Consider what we have established. Texts that describe the creation of humanity as a deliberate act of biological engineering for the purpose of service. Descriptions of technologies capable of travel through air and space. Weapons of mass destruction and medical interventions at the genetic level. An artifact called the Tablet of Destinies that conferred power over fate and time itself. A linguistic and conceptual framework in which memory and consciousness could be manipulated through divine decree, and an ongoing relationship of oversight and control in which the creators periodically intervened to adjust the course of human development. If these descriptions reflect any degree of historical reality, if even a kernel of preserved memory lies beneath the mythological elaboration, then we are contemplating a picture of early human existence radically different from what our textbooks teach. A picture in which we were not alone in our development, in which our consciousness itself may have been shaped and limited and managed by beings with agendas of their own. We are not required to accept this picture to find it worth contemplating. For even as pure mythology, it tells us something profound about how the earliest literate humans understood their place in the cosmos, not as the crown of creation, but as the created, not as actors, but as acted upon, not as those who remember freely, but as those whose memory exists at the pleasure of powers greater than themselves. The question that now hangs in the air, that has been building throughout our exploration, is whether these powers ever exercised their capability in a specific, documented way, whether there exists in the textual record evidence, not just of the potential for memory manipulation, but of its actual deployment. The ancient scribes, those patient workers in clay who preserved so much that might otherwise have been lost, suggest that such evidence does exist, scattered in fragments across tablets that were never meant to survive, references to a time that was taken, a century that was erased, a period of human history that the Anunnaki, in their council of gods, decided should be removed from human knowing. Power over destiny, the ability to reshape what is and what will be if such power existed, and the tablets insist it did, then we must ask the question we have been building toward. Was it ever used? The ancient scribes suggest it was, and they left behind fragments of what was taken. We arrive now at the heart of our inquiry, the place where accumulated evidence converges into something extraordinary, and to understand what the tablets suggest, we must first appreciate how archaeologists construct the timeline of ancient history, how they assign dates to kings and dynasties separated from us by 5,000 years of silence. The process is painstaking and imperfect, built upon layers of inference and cross-reference that would humble anyone who imagines we possess certain knowledge of the distant past. Scholars rely primarily on what are called king lists, ancient documents that recorded the succession of rulers along with the length of their reigns. And the most famous of these is the Sumerian King List, a remarkable text that traces kingship from the time it supposedly descended from heaven through flood and catastrophe down to historical dynasties we can verify through other means. Yet these lists present profound difficulties. For the early portions record reigns of impossible duration, kings who ruled for thousands or even tens of thousands of years. And scholars must decide where mythology ends and history begins, where symbolic numbers give way to actual chronology. The standard approach treats these fantastical early reigns as legendary and focuses on the later portions where reign lengths become plausible and can be correlated with archaeological evidence, with the building layers of ancient cities, with astronomical observations recorded in the tablets themselves. Through careful correlation of multiple king lists from different cities, through synchronisms with Egyptian chronology which has its own anchor points, through the patient work of stratigraphy and carbon dating, a general framework emerges. Yet this framework contains gaps and uncertainties that specialists acknowledge even as popular accounts present ancient chronology as settled fact. The truth is that our timeline for early Mesopotamia shifts and adjusts as new evidence emerges, and there remain periods where the sequence of events is genuinely unknown, where archaeological layers suggest occupation but no written records survive to tell us who lived there or what they accomplished. These gaps are not unusual in themselves, for the survival of ancient records depends on countless contingencies, on whether clay tablets were fired or merely dried, on whether buildings burned or simply crumbled, on whether later inhabitants preserved or destroyed what came before. What makes one particular gap unusual is not simply its existence, but its character, the way it seems to mark a discontinuity rather than merely an absence. And it is to this specific gap that we now turn our attention. The period in question falls roughly between 3100 and 3000 BCE, according to most chronological reconstructions, though some scholars place it slightly earlier or later, depending on their interpretive framework. And it coincides with a transition that has long puzzled researchers, the emergence of what appears to be fully formed civilization seemingly without adequate developmental precursors. Before this period, we find the late Uruk culture, a sophisticated society with complex administration, monumental architecture, and what may be the earliest experiments with writing. And after this period, we find the early dynastic era, the time of legendary kings like Gilgamesh, of city-states locked in rivalry and warfare, of art and literature that would influence cultures for millennia. What we do not find with any clarity is the transition itself, the process by which one became the other. The archaeological record shows a curious pattern at many sites, a layer of abandonment or destruction followed by what appears to be a fresh beginning, as if communities had departed and then returned, or as if new populations had arrived to build upon old foundations. At Uruk itself, the greatest city of its age, excavations reveal a break in the stratigraphic sequence, a thin layer where the normal debris of continuous occupation gives way to something else. And then above this layer the city seems to resume, but with subtle differences in ceramic styles, in architectural conventions, in the very layout of sacred spaces. Similar patterns appear at other sites throughout southern Mesopotamia, at Eridu and Ur, at Nippur and Lagash, as if a shadow had passed over the entire region and left its mark in the soil. The king lists offer their own puzzles when we examine this period, for they disagree with one another in ways that suggest more than simple scribal error. Different traditions preserve different sequences of rulers for this time, and when we attempt to correlate them, we find not merely discrepancies, but what appear to be parallel tracks that do not intersect, as if memories of entirely different histories had somehow blended together. Some lists contain names that appear nowhere else, rulers whose reigns seem to occupy the same years as other rulers. And while scholars typically explain such anomalies as overlapping dynasties in different cities or as legendary insertions, the concentration of these problems in this specific period is striking. The genealogies present perhaps the most troubling puzzle of all. For the family lines that we can trace from later periods, the ancestries of historical kings whose existence we can verify, seem to develop gaps when traced backward into this era. Generations that should connect documented figures, but instead float unmoored, names preserved by tradition, but attached to no continuous lineage. It is as if the connective tissue of ordinary historical memory had been damaged somehow, leaving isolated fragments that later scribes tried their best to weave into coherent sequence. The architectural evidence reinforces this sense of discontinuity, for buildings begun before this period sometimes show signs of having been abandoned mid-construction and then completed differently afterward, with changed floor plans or materials that suggest different builders working from different assumptions. And the great temple complexes that we know were in continuous use for centuries show curious breaks in their rebuilding sequences, moments when the pattern of renovation and expansion that normally characterized Mesopotamian sacred architecture seems to have halted and then resumed according to different principles. All of this might be explained by catastrophe, by plague or invasion or environmental collapse, and indeed scholars have proposed such explanations, yet none quite accounts for the specific character of what we observe, for the way the gap seems to affect memory and record more profoundly than it affects material culture, for the way communities that continued to exist seem to have lost track of their own immediate past. And it is here that the tablets begin to speak in a different voice, for among the hundreds of thousands of recovered texts, there exists a small corpus, perhaps 24 tablets and fragments, that reference this period in terms that suggest not accidental loss, but deliberate erasure. The tablets in question were recovered from several different sites over more than a century of excavation, and their significance was not immediately recognized because they are fragmentary and their language is difficult, employing terminology that does not appear in standard lexical lists and constructions that seem archaic even by the standards of early Sumerian. The first to attract scholarly attention was discovered at Nippur in the 1890s during the University of Pennsylvania expeditions. A small fragment catalogued among thousands of others and not translated until decades later, when a specialist in early religious texts noticed its unusual vocabulary. This tablet, now designated CBS 8383, contains only about 40 legible signs, but among them appears a phrase that subsequent discoveries would prove significant, rendered in various translations as the time made silent, or the years of silence, or the silenced time. And the context, though fragmentary, suggests this phrase refers not to a natural quiet, but to something deliberately imposed, for the signs include what appears to be an agent, someone or something that performed the silencing. For many years, this fragment was treated as an oddity, a damaged text whose interpretation remained uncertain. But between 1920 and 1975, additional tablets came to light that employed similar terminology and provided broader context. A tablet excavated at Ur, now in the British Museum, preserves what appears to be a portion of a ritual lament, the kind of text Mesopotamian priests composed to mourn destroyed temples and fallen cities. Yet this lament mourns not a city, but a time, not destroyed buildings, but erased years. And it employs the haunting phrase, "the years returned to clay," suggesting a reversal of the very process by which memory was preserved, as if time itself had been pressed back into the medium from which records were made, undoing what had been written. Another fragment, discovered at Kish and published only in 1968, contains what may be a direct reference to the mechanism of erasure, speaking of memory given to the deep. Using language that echoes the watery abyss of Mesopotamian cosmology, the primordial deep from which creation emerged, and the implication seems to be that memories were not merely destroyed, but returned to a state prior to existence, uncreated rather than forgotten. The most extensive text in this corpus was identified relatively recently in the 1990s, when a researcher at the Yale Babylonian Collection recognized that several fragments previously catalogued separately actually joined together, forming a tablet that preserves perhaps 60% of what was originally a substantial composition. This text, still not fully published due to ongoing scholarly debate about its interpretation, appears to be a narrative account of a council meeting among divine beings. And the beings in question are explicitly identified as Anunnaki, the great gods who in other texts are credited with creating humanity and establishing the order of civilization. The council convenes to address what is described as a crisis, though the word used might also mean transgression or overreaching. And the topic of deliberation is humanity, specifically certain achievements or knowledge that humanity has attained. The tablet is damaged at crucial points, and scholars disagree about how to read the surviving signs. But one interpretation suggests that humans had acquired something they were not meant to possess, had learned secrets that the Anunnaki had reserved for themselves. And the divine response was not destruction, not the flood that other texts describe, but something more precise, a removal of knowledge itself, a taking back of what had been given or stolen. The phrase that appears most frequently in scholarly discussion of this text is often translated as turning back the record or causing the account to return. And its implications are extraordinary, for it suggests not the destruction of tablets, but the reversal of memory itself, not the burning of libraries, but the unwriting of what humans had inscribed in their own minds. Subsequent passages describe the aftermath in terms that align disturbingly well with the archaeological evidence, speaking of peoples who wander not knowing their homes, of cities whose names are forgotten by those who built them, of families who cannot recall their own parents, and the duration of this confusion is specified. Though again, scholarly readings differ, as 100 years, or one great cycle of years, or one portion of the age, each translation carrying different implications, but all suggesting a substantial period of deliberately imposed amnesia. The scribal traditions that preserved these texts present their own mystery, for if memory was erased, how do any records of the erasure survive? The Mesopotamian answer may lie in what scholars call the stream of tradition, the continuous copying and recopying of texts from generation to generation that preserved literary works across millennia. For this tradition was maintained by priests and scribes who formed something like a sacred guild, initiates into the mysteries of writing, who understood their task as divine service. Several of the erasure texts contained colophons, the scribal notes that appear at the end of tablets identifying the copyist and the circumstances of copying. And these colophons employ unusual phrasing, describing the texts as hidden things or concealed matters or words from before the silence, suggesting that the scribes understood themselves as preserving secret knowledge that had somehow escaped or been exempt from the general forgetting. One colophon instructs future copyists to preserve this tablet in darkness and reveal it not to the uninstructed, language that appears nowhere else in the vast corpus of Mesopotamian literature, and that suggests a deliberate program of esoteric preservation, knowledge maintained by a select few across generations until some unspecified future time. How did these texts survive the erasure they describe? The tablets themselves suggest two possibilities: either that certain lineages were exempted from the forgetting, permitted or cursed to remember what others could not, or that the texts were created after the fact, composed by scribes who somehow reconstructed or received knowledge of what had occurred. The second possibility might seem more rational, yet the linguistic evidence complicates this interpretation. For the archaic features of the language suggest these texts originate from or faithfully copy very early compositions from the very period they describe or shortly thereafter. Some specialists have proposed that these are genuine early texts that survived the postulated erasure precisely because they were hidden, buried in temple foundations, or sealed in chambers not opened for centuries. And this would explain both their preservation and their subsequent transmission through the scribal stream, are discovered by later generations who incorporated them into the tradition without fully understanding their significance. The textual evidence for the Anunnaki Council and its decision appears across multiple tablets from different sites and different periods of copying. And while variations exist in wording and detail, the core narrative remains remarkably consistent. The council convened, the crisis debated, the solution implemented, the century unmade. This consistency extends to details that do not obviously serve theological or political purposes. Specific references to the techniques employed, to the duration of the effect, to the conditions of its eventual weakening, and such consistent specificity across independent textual traditions suggests either a common source preserved with unusual fidelity or an underlying reality that different scribes recorded from different perspectives. The scholarly mainstream has not embraced the interpretation I have outlined, and in fairness, their skepticism is methodologically appropriate, for extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and fragmentary ancient texts are subject to multiple readings. Yet the alternative explanations offered by conventional scholarship seem equally strained, treating these texts as garbled mythology or scribal exercises or deliberate mystifications without adequately explaining their consistency, their archaic language, their correlation with archaeological anomalies. their preservation through channels that suggest deliberate concealment. Perhaps the most honest scholarly position is simple uncertainty, acknowledgement that these texts exist, that their interpretation remains debated, that they describe something extraordinary, whether that something occurred in history or only in the imagination of ancient priests. What might have occurred during the erased century? What knowledge or achievement might have warranted such extreme response from beings powerful enough to implement it? The tablets themselves offer hints, damaged and fragmentary but suggestive. And when combined with the archaeological evidence of what existed before and after the gap, a speculative picture begins to emerge. The late Uruk period, immediately preceding the proposed erasure, represents something unprecedented in human history. The first true urban civilization, the first complex state society, the first system of writing. And the speed of these developments has always puzzled researchers who study cultural evolution. The standard model holds that these innovations emerged gradually over centuries, the culmination of long processes of social complexification. Yet the archaeological record shows a different pattern, an acceleration of change in the final Uruk phases that suggests not gradual evolution, but something closer to explosion, as if developments that should have taken many generations were compressed into mere decades. What drove this acceleration? Conventional answers point to economic pressures, to population growth, to the advantages of scale and specialization. Yet these factors existed elsewhere without producing comparable results. And the Uruk phenomenon remains, in the careful language of academic prose, inadequately explained. The tablets that describe the erased century may offer an explanation that scholars have been unwilling to consider, for they suggest that the acceleration was not wholly internal to human society, that the rapid advances of late Uruk reflected collaboration or instruction or intervention by beings who possessed knowledge humanity had not developed on its own. The Anunnaki, in standard mythology, are credited with teaching humanity the arts of civilization, with bestowing the me, the divine decrees that govern all aspects of culture and technology. And what if this mythology preserves a memory of actual transfer, actual teaching, the actual acceleration of human capability through external input? The crisis that the council texts describe might then be understood not as human sin or corruption, but as human success, as the achievement of capacities that were not supposed to develop, as students who surpassed their teachers or subjects who threatened their rulers. The specific nature of the forbidden achievement is never stated clearly in surviving texts, but oblique references suggest possibilities that align with persistent themes in human mythology and esoteric tradition. One passage speaks of humans who built the tower that reaches, language that inevitably recalls the biblical story of Babel with its divine punishment for architectural ambition, and the Sumerian context suggests this was more than simple building. Perhaps a reference to technology that bridged the gap between earth and sky, between human realm and divine domain. Another fragment mentions the fire of making or the creative flame, employing vocabulary associated in other texts with metallurgy and transformation, and this might indicate advances in material technology that exceeded prescribed limits. Most intriguing are references to the speaking of names and the knowing of origins, phrases that in Mesopotamian thought carry profound significance, for to know the true name of something was to have power over it. And to know origins was to understand the very nature of reality. Had humanity begun to comprehend its own creation, to understand the mechanisms by which the Anunnaki had fashioned their servant species? Had humans discovered secrets about their own nature that their creators wished kept hidden? The texts do not say clearly, and perhaps the very ambiguity is significant. For if certain knowledge was erased from memory, the records of that knowledge might be precisely what was lost, leaving only the fact of erasure without its content. What we can infer from the before and after is suggestive, for the civilization that emerges after the proposed gap is in many ways more primitive than what preceded it. The early dynastic period shows a retreat from certain Uruk-era achievements, smaller buildings, less sophisticated art, more localized trade networks, as if humanity had stepped backward before resuming its forward progress. The writing system itself shows curious development. For early Uruk proto-cuneiform includes signs and categories that disappear from later usage, as if certain concepts had become literally unrateable, as if vocabulary for things no longer remembered had fallen from the signery. And the mythology of the post-gap period emphasizes human limitation and divine supremacy in ways that earlier traditions apparently did not, presenting humanity as created servants whose purpose is labor and worship, whose proper stance is submission, whose highest aspiration is faithful service rather than understanding or equality. The question of physical evidence is perhaps the most challenging aspect of this inquiry, for if memory was erased but events still occurred, physical traces should remain, artifacts and structures from the lost century that persist even when the knowledge of their making has vanished. Here, we enter deeply speculative territory, for the archaeological record of the period in question is precisely what shows the anomalous gaps and discontinuities we have described, yet scattered through collections worldwide, are objects whose dating and provenance present unsolved problems, artifacts that seem too sophisticated for their assigned periods, technologies that appear before their supposed invention. And while mainstream archaeology typically resolves such anomalies through revised dating or claims of exceptional individual genius, the accumulation of such anomalies deserves consideration. The Antikythera mechanism, recovered from a Mediterranean shipwreck and dated to around 100 BCE, is the most famous example of what might be called a chronologically anomalous artifact, a geared computer of extraordinary sophistication that should not exist given our understanding of ancient Greek technology. And while its date places it well after the period we are discussing, it demonstrates that our assumptions about ancient technological capability may be fundamentally flawed, that civilizations possessed knowledge that was subsequently lost and only slowly recovered. The question is whether some of that lost knowledge might trace back not merely centuries but millennia to the erased period itself. Certain artifacts from early Mesopotamia present their own puzzles, carved stone vessels whose precision suggests mechanical lathes not otherwise attested, or metallurgical products whose composition indicates techniques not redeveloped for thousands of years, architectural achievements whose construction methods remain uncertain. The standard response to such claims is skeptical, and appropriately so, for it is easy to underestimate ancient capability and to project modern assumptions onto evidence that might have simpler explanations. Yet the concentration of such puzzles in and around the gap period may not be coincidental. If a century of advanced human achievement was erased from memory but not from physical existence, we would expect exactly what we find: isolated artifacts that seem out of place, techniques whose origins cannot be traced, constructions whose methods were forgotten, a scatter of physical evidence orphaned from its conceptual context. The survivors of the erasure, waking as if from sleep into a world containing objects they could not remember making, might have preserved these things as sacred mysteries, as gifts from the gods, as remnants of a golden age whose nature they could no longer recall. And this might explain the reverent treatment given to certain ancient objects in later Mesopotamian tradition, items maintained in temples for centuries, despite no living memory of their origin or purpose. The possibility that some individuals or lineages retained memory, while the general population forgot, opens another dimension of this inquiry. For if the erasure was not absolute, if certain people were exempted or resistant, their descendants might carry knowledge down through generations in forms that appear mythological or esoteric to outside view. The great mystery traditions of the ancient world, the Egyptian priesthoods with their claims of knowledge stretching back to the first time, the Brahmins of India with their precisely preserved Vedic texts, the Magi of Persia with their astronomical and prophetic learning, all present themselves as custodians of primordial wisdom transmitted from an age before ordinary history. And while conventional scholarship treats such claims as legitimating rhetoric, the consistency of the claim across unconnected cultures invites consideration. The Mesopotamian precedent might explain this pattern, for if certain individuals retained memory of the erased century, their knowledge would indeed be primordial relative to the reset civilization around them, wisdom from before the beginning, as far as ordinary history could tell. And their descendants might form precisely the kind of priestly lineages that claim such inheritance. The texts themselves hint at such exemption, speaking of those who were marked and those who carried the signs, employing vocabulary associated elsewhere with religious initiation and divine election. And this might represent either a deliberate provision in the erasure, certain lineages preserved as caretakers or witnesses, or an imperfection in the process, individuals whose minds proved resistant to the imposed forgetting. Either possibility would result in the same phenomenon: a small minority who remembered what the majority could not, who gradually organized themselves into institutions charged with preserving and transmitting their anomalous knowledge, who developed the elaborate secrecy and initiation practices that characterize esoteric traditions precisely because their knowledge would seem impossible or blasphemous to those who shared the collective amnesia. The scribe guilds of Mesopotamia might be the direct descendants of such a preserved lineage, for their traditions suggest awareness of hidden knowledge, of texts not to be shown to the uninstructed, of wisdom reserved for those properly prepared, and the preservation of the very tablets that describe the erasure might be their most significant legacy, fragments of truth saved against the day when humanity might be ready to remember. If memory was erased in Mesopotamia, what of the rest of the world? For humanity in 3100 BCE was not confined to southern Iraq, and populations in Egypt, in the Indus Valley, in China, in Europe, in the Americas were all pursuing their own developmental paths. The tablets speak specifically of the black-headed people, the Sumerians' self-designation, yet the effects they describe could hardly be confined to a single region if the beings implementing them possessed the cosmic power elsewhere attributed to the Anunnaki. And indeed, the archaeological evidence from other regions shows patterns that invite comparison. Egypt, during this same period, underwent its own mysterious transition, the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt under the first pharaohs, an event whose mechanism remains unclear and whose records from the unification period itself are surprisingly sparse, given the elaborate documentation of later Egyptian history. The Indus Valley shows a similar pattern of advanced urban civilization appearing with unexpected rapidity in the centuries following 3000 BCE, as if development had somehow accelerated after a period of slower growth. In Northern Europe, the megalithic tradition that would produce Stonehenge and its contemporaries began intensive construction during this same era, mobilizing labor and engineering knowledge on a scale difficult to explain, given what we know of the populations involved. Could all of these developments represent parallel recoveries from a worldwide erasure, different regions resuming their interrupted progress at roughly the same time, starting over from points of reset that occurred simultaneously around the globe? The synchronicity of these developments has been noted by scholars who attribute it to the spread of ideas along trade routes or to parallel responses to common environmental conditions. Yet these explanations struggle to account for the specific timing and character of the changes, for the way widely separated regions seem to experience similar discontinuities at similar moments. The alternative explanation that a single event affected human memory across the entire planet, that the Anunnaki or beings like them implemented a global erasure with only partial success, seems fantastic, yet would account for patterns that conventional explanations handle awkwardly. The flood narratives that appear in mythologies worldwide, stories of a cataclysmic deluge that reset human civilization, might preserve distorted memory of the erasure event. Nay, translated into the familiar language of physical disaster, because a century of stolen time is far harder to conceptualize than a century of risen water. The survivors in these stories, the Noahs and Utnapishtims and Manus and Deucalions, might represent not those who escaped drowning, but those who escaped forgetting. The preserved lineages who carried knowledge across the gap and became the ancestors of the mystery traditions and their divine warnings, the instructions they received to prepare for the coming catastrophe, might reflect actual communication from beings who knew what was planned and chose to preserve some thread of continuity. If this account holds any truth, and we must remain humble about certainty, it raises a profound question, not just what was taken, but how. For the mechanics of forgetting on a civilizational scale would require power almost beyond imagination, almost. The tablets that speak of the erasing do not describe it as a sudden violence or a catastrophic event, but rather as something closer to a ritual, a procedure carried out with careful intention across what must have been an extended period of preparation. And when we examine the specific language used by the ancient scribes, we find terminology that modern translators have struggled to render into contemporary terms because the concepts seem to exist somewhere between the technological and the spiritual in ways that our categories do not easily accommodate. The texts reference Enki, the Lord of Wisdom and the deep waters, as the architect of the process itself, the one who understood the mechanisms by which memory could be lifted from the living mind and returned to formlessness, while Enlil, the Lord of the command and the breath of authority, provided the decree that made such an action permissible within the cosmic order. And what emerges from these fragmentary accounts is a picture of collaboration among beings who possessed not only the will to reshape human consciousness, but apparently the means to do so on a scale we can barely conceptualize. The scribes describe something they call the sealing, a moment when the work of forgetting was completed and fixed into place so that it would persist across generations. And they use language that suggests this sealing involved what we might today call the informational substrate of reality itself. As though memory were not merely stored in individual brains, but woven into a larger fabric that could be altered at its source. Central to understanding how the Anunnaki conceived of such power is the concept of the me, those divine decrees or fundamental patterns that governed all aspects of existence, from kingship to the crafts to the cycles of nature. And among the me were those that pertained to consciousness, to knowing and unknowing, to the boundaries of what mortal minds could contain, and if beings existed who could access and manipulate these foundational patterns, then the alteration of collective memory would be not a violation of natural law, but an application of it, a use of the same principles by which reality itself was maintained and ordered. The ritualistic elements described in the tablets suggest that the process required more than simple technological intervention, involving ceremonies conducted at specific locations where the boundaries between the earthly and the celestial were considered thin. And these sites correspond intriguingly to places that would later become centers of religious practice and mystery traditions, as though some echo of their original function persisted even after the specific memory of that function had been removed from human awareness. When we step back from the Mesopotamian accounts and survey the mythological traditions of cultures around the world, we encounter a pattern so consistent that it demands our attention regardless of how we choose to interpret it. For nearly every ancient civilization preserves some memory of forgotten ages, of times that were deliberately obscured or cyclically erased and renewed, of knowledge that was once possessed and then lost through means that seemed to transcend ordinary forgetting. The Greeks spoke of the river Lethe that flowed through the underworld, whose waters the souls of the dead were required to drink before being reborn, washing away all memory of their previous existence. And while we tend to read this as poetic metaphor for the mystery of why we do not remember past lives, the structural parallel to the Sumerian accounts is striking. For both traditions encode the idea that forgetting can be administered, that memory can be deliberately removed by powers greater than the individual human being. In the Hindu tradition, we find the concept of Maya, often translated as illusion, but more accurately understood as the veil that conceals the true nature of reality from ordinary perception. And coupled with this is the doctrine of the yugas, vast cosmic cycles in which knowledge rises and falls, in which humanity periodically loses access to wisdom it once possessed. And while the mechanisms differ from the Mesopotamian accounts, the underlying pattern remains, this sense that our current state of awareness represents a diminishment from some earlier, fuller knowing. The Mesoamerican cultures preserved elaborate calendrical systems, tracking what they called world ages or suns, each ending in cataclysm and renewal, and embedded within these traditions are accounts of previous humanities who achieved great things and then were swept away, their accomplishments surviving only as fragments and mysteries that the current age inherits without understanding. And the Maya in particular seem to have been haunted by the sense that they were trying to recover something that had been lost, that their astronomical and mathematical achievements were reconstructions rather than original discoveries. Perhaps most intriguing are the traditions preserved by Aboriginal Australians, whose concept of the dream time or the dreaming suggests a relationship with the past radically different from linear Western history. For in their understanding, the creation era is not simply back there in the distant past, but exists in a continuous present that can be accessed, and the ancestors who shaped the world during that time are not dead, but sleeping. And the stories and songlines that preserve their actions are not merely commemorative, but are the actual medium through which the world continues to exist. And one wonders whether this different orientation toward time and memory might represent a form of knowing that survived whatever process of forgetting affected other human populations. Modern science has begun to reveal just how fragile and malleable human memory actually is. And these findings provide an unexpected context for considering whether mass memory alteration might be possible. For if individual memory is so easily influenced and distorted, then collective memory, which depends on the accumulation and transmission of individual recollections, must be even more vulnerable. Neuroscience has demonstrated that memories are not stored like files in a computer, fixed and unchanging until accessed, but are reconstructed each time they are recalled, assembled from fragments scattered across different brain regions. And each act of remembering is also an act of subtle revision, as the memory is recolored by present circumstances and then restored in its altered form. And over time, even vivid memories can drift quite far from the original experience they purport to represent. The phenomenon of false memory has been extensively documented by researchers who have shown that it is surprisingly easy to implant entirely fabricated recollections in human subjects, who will then recall these invented events with the same confidence and emotional intensity as genuine memories. And this malleability seems to be not a flaw in the system, but an inherent feature of how human cognition works, prioritizing utility and coherence over archival accuracy. When we extend these findings from individual psychology to collective memory, we find that societies can forget remarkably quickly, that knowledge which seems secure and permanent can vanish within a few generations if the transmission chains are broken. And we have documented examples from recent history of sophisticated technologies and practices being lost simply because the people who knew them died without passing on their understanding, with skills that took centuries to develop, evaporating in decades when circumstances changed. The research into electromagnetic effects on brain function adds another dimension to these considerations, for we now know that properly configured fields can influence neural activity, affecting mood and cognition in measurable ways. And while current technology can only produce modest effects, the principle that consciousness can be externally influenced through physical means has been established, and if beings existed with far more sophisticated understanding of these principles, operating at scales and with precision beyond our current capabilities, then the deliberate alteration of memory states across populations moves from the impossible into the merely improbable. Some researchers working at the intersection of physics and consciousness have begun to explore models in which information itself is fundamental to reality, in which what we call matter and energy are manifestations of underlying informational patterns. And within such frameworks, consciousness and memory would not be epiphenomena produced by physical brains, but would participate in this more basic informational layer. And if reality itself is in some sense informational or computational, then the boundaries we assume between mind and world, between remembering and reality, might be far more permeable than our everyday experience suggests. The deepest question raised by all of this may be epistemological rather than historical. For how would we know if we had forgotten something? How would we detect an absence that by definition has left no trace in our awareness? And this is not merely a philosophical puzzle, but a genuine limitation on what we can claim to know about our own past. Our confidence in history rests on records and artifacts, on the assumption that important events leave evidence. But this assumption may itself be a kind of forgetting, a failure to recognize that evidence can be destroyed, suppressed, or misinterpreted, that the archive is always incomplete, and that completeness is always an illusion, maintained by forgetting what has been forgotten. We distinguish between gaps in the record, places where we know that we do not know, and confident knowledge, places where we believe our understanding is secure. But this distinction assumes that the boundaries between known and unknown are themselves knowable, that we can reliably identify where our ignorance lies. And yet, if forgetting has been comprehensive enough, then even the sense that something is missing might be absent, replaced by a smooth continuity that reveals no seam. Perhaps the most honest response to these considerations is a kind of epistemological humility, a willingness to hold our historical knowledge more lightly, to recognize that the past we think we know is a construction based on fragmentary evidence filtered through interpretive frameworks that are themselves historical products, subject to their own distortions and limitations. And yet, alongside this uncertainty, we might notice certain phenomena that resist easy explanation. The strange sense of familiarity that sometimes arises in places we have never been. The intuitions that seem to come from nowhere, carrying knowledge we cannot account for. The persistent feeling that human beings sometimes report of having lost something important that they cannot name or remember. And while none of these experiences constitute evidence in any rigorous sense, they do suggest that forgetting, even comprehensive forgetting, may not be absolute, that some trace of what was known might persist in forms we do not yet understand, in the body perhaps, in patterns of behavior and perception, in dreams, in the odd resonances that certain myths and symbols evoke in us, though we cannot say why. We cannot prove what the tablets suggest, and we cannot disprove it either. And perhaps that uncertainty is itself a kind of answer, a reminder that our grip on history, even recent history, is far more tenuous than we imagine. And what we can do is sit with the question and listen to what silence might be trying to tell us. And so, we return to where we began, to the clay itself, to the weight of earth pressed between ancient fingers, and to the quiet miracle of marks made in mud that somehow survived the collapse of empires and the forgetting of languages and the long silence of buried libraries. Somewhere in this very moment, a scholar sits beneath fluorescent lights, squinting at a tablet no larger than a human palm, trying to coax meaning from symbols pressed into wet earth 5,000 years ago by someone whose name we will never know, but whose careful work outlasted pyramids and temples and the memory of kings. This is what we do, we who inherited this strange compulsion to record and preserve and remember. We scratch marks into whatever surface will hold them. We tell stories to our children. We build archives and museums and databases, all in defiance of the forgetting that claims everything eventually. Perhaps this drive itself is a kind of remembering, some deep instinct that knows we have lost things before and refuses to let it happen again without a fight. The tablets we have discussed tonight, whether they preserve literal history or elaborate mythology, or something stranger still that our categories cannot quite contain, represent humanity, talking to itself across an abyss of time, sending messages forward into futures their authors could not imagine, trusting that someone someday would care enough to listen. We cannot know with certainty what the Anunnaki were, whether beings of flesh who descended from elsewhere or projections of human imagination onto the mystery of our own origins, or perhaps something in between that our either-or thinking cannot accommodate. We cannot prove that a century was taken from human memory, though the gaps in the record whisper and the texts speak of silences imposed from above. What we can know is that we are creatures haunted by the sense that something is missing, that the story we tell about ourselves has chapters torn out, that we are older and stranger than we remember. Perhaps this feeling is merely the narcissism of a species that wants to believe it matters cosmically. Or perhaps it is the faint echo of genuine loss, the ghost limb sensation of amputated history. We are still so early in this work of recovery. Hundreds of thousands of tablets remain unstudied, their contents unknown, their secrets patient. Beneath the sands of Iraq and Syria and Iran, beneath the foundations of modern cities built unknowingly atop ancient ones, more clay waits in darkness for the light that will eventually find it. What else might these buried archives contain? What other uncomfortable truths or beautiful errors or genuine revelations lie waiting for the right scholar with the right question at the right moment of history? We do not know. We cannot know. And perhaps that is not a failure, but an invitation. Not a door closed, but a door we have not yet found the courage or the readiness to open. Tonight, we have walked together through one small corner of this immense mystery, following threads that may lead to profound truth or may dissolve into the beautiful nothing of speculation. Either way, the journey had value. Either way, we have thought together about memory and time, and the strange persistence of clay, and the even stranger persistence of the human need to know where we came from. The tablets hold their silence now as they have held it for millennia, neither confirming nor denying, simply existing as testimony that once, long ago, someone thought these things important enough to write down, and that against all probability, the writing survived. Somewhere beneath the sands, more tablets wait. Some hold grocery lists and property disputes. Some hold letters between lovers long since turned to dust. And perhaps some hold more pieces of what we were made to forget. For now, they keep their silence. And for now, so do we. Sleep well, and let your dreams wander through ancient cities where scribes worked by lamplight, pressing meaning into earth. Perhaps you will remember something by morning that you did not know you had forgotten. Perhaps we all will. The clay is patient. It has waited this long. It can wait a little longer for us to be ready.